Great. So, hi everyone. Congratulations for making it to the finals. I'm Carlos. I will be your chair for this round, and I'll give some time for the panelists to introduce themselves by order of tab.
Hi everyone, Randall here. Good luck, have fun, cheers.
Jalson, you're next, I think. Riva, then.
Hi, my name is Riva. Best of luck to all teams.
Yep, Ziggy, best of luck.
Okay. So, everyone's here and complete. Now calling on Prime Minister.
All right, am I audible, visible?
Yes to both.
Okay. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Some things like culture are incredibly valuable to people. It's something that we ought not to mess with. Firstly, what is culture? Then what is this dominant culture approach thing? Then I'll get into my arguments. Firstly, culture is just something incredibly important in this debate, right? 4 things I want to talk about here. Firstly, it's incredibly sensitive, right? Just the fact that this could extremely hugely damage person's lives to even if you say very few things. This looks like, just pointing out hey, what do you do in that bathroom when just, Muslims are performing wudu or something and it looks weird, etc. Just saying that inflicts huge amounts of psychological harm because you're already so, let's say, unsure about if this is okay and that sort of stuff. Point is, this can really damage people from very small actions. Secondly, it's a huge part of people's identity, right? The culture that you grow up in is fundamentally a huge component of who you are. Because as a person, who you are, the only things that encompass this are the actions that you take, are the beliefs that you have, and the communities that you have. Not all of these things are implicated in culture, and thereby it's a huge facet of your identity. Thirdly, it's incredibly fragile as well. I think this goes with sensitivity. Fourthly, the idea is that it's incredibly wildly different in all across the globe. This looks like in Japan, it's actually nice to slurp while you're eating. It makes the guest, or rather the cook feel like they actually made good food. Yet in Pakistan, people would shame you for doing that. Point is, it's incredibly wildly different, and it does not even have very similar moral lines in most cases, right? So if opposition wants to claim that this is actually doable, they need to prove why it's actually something that people can actually do. We don't think that's true. Then what does cultural approach look like? I want to just flag out, this debate is not going to be about genocides or politics probably, because those things have far greater different incentives than cultural approaches. Those consider things like economics, political gains, etc. Thereby, this dominant intercultural approach probably means things like study abroad, things like exchange students. This also looks like probably meetings with foreign people in I don't know, China if you're making a factory or something, or also just simple things like casual conversations with your friend abroad or something that you met online, that sort of stuff. We think this debate primarily exists within the social sphere, i.e. individuals interacting with each other. For group dynamics and politics, we think there are far many more different reasons for any sort of cultural approach dynamics. At that point, then, why is our world one of far greater respect for the other culture, and why in opposition world, comprehensibility would equate to appropriation of the cultures? Firstly, why do we, on better respect? Firstly, this is just hugely valuable. I've already flagged this at my top of the speech. But thing is that this is literally a huge part of your childhood. It is what the most closest people, the most proximate people to you have told you to be virtues in life. It is also the things that make you happy, right? The fact that perhaps prayer makes me happy when I go to it 5 times a day. This is something that is incredibly valuable to me and me only, but also most importantly, fourthly, because it's a huge part of the self, and insofar as there's nothing more of a virtue than the self for each person. That is why we have individual human rights. That is why we value autonomy and agency. It is at that point then that even culture has huge, value in of itself. Why then is it likely that we have better respect on our side of the world? Firstly, I just want to flag that we still think people are human beings for a lot of reasons, right? Because even if you meet people from other cultures that you don't understand, you still see that they have nose and face, etc. So there's fundamental reasons for you to believe that they're still human, but also because of the way they act. They speak to you in the same way that you talk to them. The fact that they still eat food, the same kind of food that you were going to eat. The fact that you're working on the same projects, etc. Meaning there's going to be multiple layers of, let's say, relation that you can have with them, meaning what's the word? Understanding their culture is not the one and only way that you can have empathy for people. But also, secondly, the idea here is when there's a mystery in front of you, you don't really understand them. It is at that point that you also have respect for these sorts of things, right? This looks at the fact that we respect things like billionaires, etc., because we really don't know anything about them other than the fact that they exist and they're like popular or whatever, or they've done we know like one or two things about them, right? But at the point at which we find out dirty secrets about like celebrities or something, they suddenly look like very random people that we can disrespect, etc. Point is, just not knowing about people inherently gives you reason to be respectful to them in terms of human psyche. Thirdly, just by thinking that you don't understand the other side, there's far more psychological reason for you to be far more self-aware. This means every single action that you take, you're far more likely to think twice or think about if everyone around you is doing that or does it seem like an appropriate thing to do. Yes, you're still going to make mistakes, but the frequency of that is far lower at the point at which you're far more aware of what you're doing. You're willing to do things like ask questions that this is okay and that sort of stuff. Fourthly, again, people do reactions to lots of things, right? When you enter a new culture, you're like, why the hell are you doing that? Why would you do this sort of thing, right? These things are far more propelled than opposition side, where you think that you have a right to a judgment, right? Uniquely in our world, when you don't understand these things, your first instinct is to understand and see and try and like see what's going on, because again, you clearly can't understand it. Perhaps ask questions later, because again, you can't understand it. They can't explain it to you. So clearly, therefore, you have a lot more reason to keep down your reactions. Note reactions are a huge harm upon people, because again, culture is very sensitive and fragile for a lot of people. Lastly, again, people, what's the word? When you interact with a new culture, those people are inherently a lot scrutinizing. This is why when immigrants come to Japan, Japanese people, when meeting them, are a lot more scrutinizing. Is this person actually observing proper Japanese etiquette? Meaning, it's especially important at the first interaction that you observe this respect. Before I prove why this way over the vibes that opposition going to talk about,
So why is being told that you can understand or have commonalities with culture a result to appropriation? But secondly, if you just avoid and don't acknowledge cultures, isn't it easier to misrepresent them on your side?
You don't represent them because you can understand them. So misrepresenting is something that you only do when you think you can understand them and thereby pass a judgment. I'll talk about that later. Then why can we waiver any vibes? Because opposition can talk about, hey, it's nicer to have, what's the word, conversation with people that you understand. We think this is a truth, but it is not worth the problems. For five reasons of weighing. Firstly, first I just want to point out discrimination is going to be symmetric because you discriminate based on, simple biases or whatever, right? Just the fact that, even in their side, even if you think you understand them, this doesn't mean you agree with them, right? So you might think you understand why Muslims put like their foot in the sinks, right? But you're gonna still think that's disgusting because you still have your ways of thinking, and you're more than willing to apply it onto them because you understand them. So even though you understand, you can also disagree. So discrimination symmetric. Then second thing, the cost of herd identity is far deeper and far greater, far over a long time, insofar as cultural identity is so important to people. Thirdly, this is bad for media, right? Because this propels anti-immigrant narratives, which is essentially crucial in today's day and age, where all these countries are becoming far more anti-immigrant, specifically because there are many more interactions that end up being incredibly appropriative. And when you have a lot more actions happening, that's when it meets the media more often. We might also have this, they just have it a lot more, insofar as when it happens a lot more, when you see this on your feed multiple times, you think it's a complete problem, as opposed to in our world where you see it once or twice and maybe like, oh, okay, that happened, right? Then why does comprehensibility mean appropriation? Firstly, because of the human ego. You think you know more than you do, insofar as, again, you like to feel like you're powerful, right? Secondly, you like to think like, what's the word? It's likely that you would think that you've studied enough, and that's probably it, because what is the limit? There is no limit. Then the thing here is that this just empowers accidents, because note how uniquely in our world, respect acts as a boundary to free will. You can't just do whatever you want. You need to think before it. Doesn't exist there. Secondly, you want to affirm your understanding. Hey, I understand Japanese people. I'll go do this restaurant, do whatever, right? Note that this is incredibly harmful, but again, you can only do this because you think you can do this. Look, anything that they say needs to be weighed against a huge harm to the most vulnerable, the people of this identity, the selves that would not be very well off in opposition.
Thank you for that great speech. Now calling on Leader of Opposition.
Hi, just confirming, am I audible and visible?
Yes to both.
Awesome. Give me 1 second and I'll start the speech. OG fails to engage with the idea that there are dominant cultures and there are less dominant cultures, and the idea that that means that at the point which you cannot understand each other, empathy ceases to exist, and how this disproportionately harms the least dominant cultures. Let's start with some setup. What does this actually look like? It probably looks like the type of narratives you see in media, the types of things they talk about in schooling, the emphasis on coming to understand each other's cultures in school environments, things like harmony days, cultural exchanges. It looks like probably also the most common way this occurs is it looks like finding analogous behaviors, traditions, or functions in your own culture, right? It looks like finding an analogous tradition for a tradition from another culture, so you can be like, oh, this is like when we do that. And what does cultural incomprehensibility actually look like? One, it looks like the narrative that is impossible to understand. That means you do not make an attempt to learn, you do not make an attempt to understand, because it is impossible to do so. Okay, let's start with the main push that comes from OO. This is going to increase empathy, it increases cultural acceptance, and it increases how much dominant cultures are willing to protect minority or less dominant cultures. Why? If it's impossible to understand, you do not try. And this is something that will emphasize otherness, right? It emphasizes the idea that cultures are different. However, human beings require similarities in order to be able to feel empathy. And that's for the very simple reason that the way people feel empathy is by finding related experiences in themselves, by finding experiences that they say, I can imagine what it feels like to be in your shoes. If there are no similarities, and obviously culture isn't the only thing that carries similarities, but as characterized by PM, it's a really large part of it. So the less similarities there are, the much harder it is to feel empathy for someone, because you cannot imagine feeling the emotions that they feel. You cannot imagine doing the actions that they do. And that's super important. Really simple intuition pump for this. We feel the most empathy towards the people we know the most about because we are most able to understand their experiences. Things like films and media increase the amount of empathy you feel for certain groups because you now understand their experiences better. People care the most about other people because they're the most similar to us. And then after that, we care much, much more about mammals like dogs and cats than we care about reptiles because mammals are more similar to us than reptiles are to us. What that means, is that empathy increases with similarity. The more you emphasize differences, the harder it is for people to feel empathy towards one another. This is especially true in the absence of direct contact or in limited direct contact. And that's because you can't understand the experiences by seeing people. You don't get the same level of empathy that you get from just directly being in the same room with someone. So you rely on things like being able to understand their situation. That means that because you fail to understand, you fail to empathize. And this is scalable, right? If you understand a bit less, you empathize a bit less. And what that means is that you fail to get the support of majorities to protect minorities, and that's really important for a range of reasons. But first, I'll take the POI from closing.
Yeah. The universe and the depths of the ocean are unknowable, yet we still strive to understand them, and we still have an awe of them.
But they're not unknowable, though, because people go and do research and do science to figure out what is in the depths of the ocean and the extent of the universe. That's why we send out lunar probes. They're not completely unknowable. Otherwise, we wouldn't be researching them. What's actually unknowable is the universe beyond the time barrier, which we don't go beyond because we can't. Cool. What is the impact? And let's follow along this argument. It also means you get less artwork on minorities, less artwork about minority cultures, specifically in a way that's presented to appeal to majority cultures. And that's because there's no interest, right? Because if they think they can't understand the culture, then why would they want to see cultural artworks from that minority? And additionally, especially in places where you have diasporic minorities or extremely small minorities, they actually need to appeal to the majority in order to get that artwork made in the first place, because otherwise you don't recoup the investment you put into the art in the first place. And what that means is that you just get less art by minorities, for minorities as well. And that's particularly important, and that's an independent harm of whether or not you believe that empathy increases or decreases. But if you do believe that this magnifies all of the other harms I've talked about empathy decreasing, because the less artwork there is, again, the less understanding there is, the less people are able to empathize with people. Think about the way that literature written by women was extremely essential in getting suffragettes to achieve their goals. And that is I guess an example of how it's really important to build empathy through artwork before you're able to push these goals. What does this mean? One, it means immigrants get a lot less protection in their communities because people are less able to empathize with them. There's a greater push to assimilate because there's a view that cultures are mutually incomprehensible, which means that there's an extreme push on division. It feeds into right-wing narratives that immigrants are too different to coexist peacefully in a society. And that means that people push them more to assimilate, and you get stronger anti-immigrant rhetoric, you get worse outcomes for immigrants, you get worse protections for immigrants. And that's because it directly feeds into, again, all of these right-wing messages of immigrants are incomprehensible.
Yeah,
because I feel like I can't understand immigrants, I believe what people tell me about immigrants. I believe what right-wing people tell me about immigrants because I can't understand the immigrant that's living down the street from me because I've been told that their culture is incomprehensible to me, that they're incomprehensible to me. And it means that you believe that they cause division in your society. Let's weigh this. The main way people come into contact with other cultures is through immigration, mostly because travel is quite expensive, inaccessible, and infrequent. The most common ways, the people I come into from different cultures that I come into contact most frequently with are immigrants. And they're also the most vulnerable because they're isolated from their original cultural community, and diasporic cultures are the most likely to die out because they are forced to assimilate into the main culture. Okay, third point under this. It decreases global cooperation because you get less empathy, you get less artwork, you get less interconnection between cultures, you get less cultural exchange. And what that means is that these cultures become much more incomprehensible. And the important thing to note here is you don't do things like translate artworks for other audiences because you think they can't understand you, and those audiences never view that because they believe they can't understand you. That means you get far less interest in global affairs. The only way people learn about global affairs is now through the news. This doesn't drive the same level of intrigue. It doesn't drive the same popularity that films, literature, TV shows do. And what that means is you just care a lot less about what's happening in other places in the world. And that's really, really bad because aid is essential to a lot of smaller developing countries. And that aid needs to come from the empathy of larger Western countries. It needs to come from, not it needs to, but one of the ways it comes is from larger, more developed countries, from the pressure that citizens inside those countries exercise. It's also really important in post-conflict states because people are much more likely to push for a reconciliatory approach, a reconciliatory solution at the point where they believe it's possible, at the point where they don't blindly believe that cultural differences mean these groups will be at odds forever, and they believe that it's possible to reconcile. That means A, those groups are more likely to come to the negotiating table to reconcile, and B, people who are pushing their governments to take action, people who are pushing their governments to mediate a solution are more likely to push for reconciliation, less likely to support war. For all of those reasons, OO.
Thank you for that great speech. Now calling on the Deputy Prime Minister.
All right, am I audible?
Loud and clear.
All right, thanks. Before my speech, my gender pronouns is she, her, and if you have any POA, please write in a chat box. And okay. All right. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1, start. Most of the LO's case was based on these two facts. One, if you try to understand, you can understand and you can agree to that. And two, if you don't on the outside of the house, people suddenly stop trying to understand their culture out of nowhere. So I'm going to deny both of these premises so that we win this debate. Very happy to propose. So first point was about they're mentioning about how this empathy is going to usually decrease on our side of the house. However, you do not need cultural understanding to feel empathy towards someone. For example, in the United States, most of people feel sorry for the people who got killed or who massacred in Gaza, who they do not even have any contact before. They do not they barely know about each other's culture in the first place, and still these people manage to have to some extent of empathy. That's the basic emotion of human beings, and you do not need this cultural understanding in the first place. And then B, even if that's true, even if that's true, you have to have like some understanding against these like specific racial people to feel empathy because like you're psycho or something like that. There's like, you know, like great social media, internet, like which is providing like human rights agency or something like that, which like always provide you this kind of like information, what is happening like all around the world. There's influencers who also tells you what is happening on their side of the house or something like that. So you do not need like cultural understanding or like appropriation or something like that to feel empathy. That's like so basic of human beings. This case does not stand. And nextly, I'm going to explain like why this like understanding and like attempt of understanding kind of things is also like wrong from the premises. First of all, about like understanding is not equal to agreement. As my prime minister has already told you, like this equality like does not simply stand. Like even if like they're trying to understand and they feel like they understand like fully, it's simply going to like miscategorization, like misunderstanding. Why? Because like you're probably going to like categorize this and that. Oh, so like your culture of this is probably our culture of this or something like that. In most cases, that doesn't even stand. As my like prime minister has already told you, there's like a bunch of different things in like all around the world, and it's impossible to like simulate all these kind of things. And second of all, B, the value is different. Like even if you're going to have like similar cultural things, kind of things. So like since like you were formed, like since your like value is formed or like different background, it's like really hard to change. When you think you can understand and you can agree to all of the culture, if you feel or like saw something like that's different from your value or culture, and you realize that like you can't really understand that kind of things, then now your value judgment hits different. Normally, like we don't do that kind of things, or like you can like push your value, like saying, oh, like that's not like a normal thing to do. Like why would you even do that? Oh, like that's so dirty. Or like that's so like inefficient. Like that's inhygienic or something like that. So since you're already like internalized, we are all same at the root, so we can understand each other. This is going to like rot your value judgment. For example, this is similar to the like parents-kids relationship. When parents can feel you can understand your kids 100%, they sometimes like over the borderline between their kids. So the important fact here is that even if like you're going to like think, oh, you can fully understand, at least like on our side of the house, since you know the fact that you do not understand that person at all, like you do not understand like others' culture like in 100% degree, you're going to like learn this like respect of the border of the like borderline in the first place. And nextly, I'm going to explain why the attempt of understanding is still going to happen on our side of the house. Since this is necessary, as like Elo has talking about, like this kind of like cultural like education was still happening in the school, and especially in this like international society, we have to know about like each other. Like since this is like necessary, I do not think like suddenly the attempt of understanding will stop anyway. And then B, like as a human being, like we do not want to like show up like being rude. For example, like I'm teaming up with like Hamza, like I'm from South Korea, like he's from like Pakistan. I don't know like anything about his culture, so like I do like tons of research before I team up with him, like something like that. Like I do not want to like show up as like a rude person because I do understand. I can't understand his culture 100%, and I cannot like agree to that like 100%. So like I do not want to like be rude in front of him because I'm a human being who wants to like be polite in other person, right? So see, and also we have the curiosity, like we want to know like what's in the like deep in the sea, like even if like so like even in the status quo, people like consume tons of like fun fiction, like people consume like tons of like National Geographic, people consume so like tons of like a culture like different cultural like stuff every single day, even though like that's not even like close to them. So the point here is that even though that is like not really close to them, like even though that is not like really something they can understand, people still want to know because that's the curiosity human being like inherently has inside of their nature. Third of all, I'm going to explain like why racial discrimination is still going to happen on the rest of the house, and that's actually going to be worse. Their premise was that like same human being can like understand each other like 100%, so they can agree to each other. So there's going to be less like racial discrimination or that kind of like there's going to be like more negotiation like post-conflict or something like that. But we already proved that this is also like impossible to do that because like if you're going to like see something that's different from your culture and you're feeling like you can understand that, and then you're going to be like, that's something like unnormal, like abnormal, so like that's why like you can understand or something like that. And then B, the sense of respect is only going to like grow on our side of the house. So even when you're trying to have this negotiation table, you still have to like respect each other, but that kind of things will never going to happen on their side of the house. Why? Because they're basically misunderstanding each other's culture, and then they're going to have like lesser and lesser effort to like understand each other. Why? Because like they didn't like see the border in the first place. And then C, even if that's true and people are going to like stop like judging about like cultural things on their side of the house, they have like people still have lots and lots of metric to judge about. For example, people want to judge onto like poverty or like skin color or history or something that's totally irrelevant from the culture. People will still find some reason to like judge on you. For example, they're talking about like I'm going to like believe whatever far right is because it's culturally wrong, etc., etc. However, if you're Republican, I think you will believe that what Republican would say anyway. So in the end of the day, the impacts our cases was clear. One, we're going to have like much better first impression when you like encounter someone, because we understand the boundary between people. And second of all, we're going to have like a better and safer public imagery for like immigrants people, especially like in a foreign country. Third of all, like developed world people like feel going to like less attacked and disrespected by the like aliens. Why? Because they're going to like they're trying like not like over the line, but they're like simply going to respect what you have already now. So first of all, like this is going to like prevent a huge long-term deep harm to like those culturally like appropriate like, situation. So from all those reasons, like we are very happy to propose. Thank you.
Thank you for that. That closes top half, the open closing half. Now calling on member of government.
Am I audible?
Yes, audible, visible.
Cool. I don't mind how you ask me POIs. Feel free to do whatever. I want to start the speech by pointing out that recently the Sophia World's manual was updated to allow teams at closing to point out that their opening have given very restrictive and uncharitable framing about the debate in order to limit the scope of the debate for the closing half unfairly. And I think it's quite ridiculous for the Prime Minister to get up in this debate and say that there is no impact on politics or no impact on broader issues. This is purely about individual interactions, because they then proceeded to go and talk about immigration and other political issues. And that has been the meat of the round so far. And therefore, I don't think you should hold us to that framing whatsoever, because it is common sense that culture impacts dynamics between world leaders. It impacts negotiation. It impacts workplaces, because it is humans conducting those types of interactions. So although we think opening government makes correct micro observations on interactions, there is a wider debate to impact about society. First, I think I want to do some framing here, because when you approach someone and assume that they are similar in terms of their culture, and then they aren't, and those differences become a standout, and you're suddenly caught by surprise, you, in a lot of cases, assume that they are weird, and you employ an ethnocentric approach to how you begin to interpret that culture, because you're seeing it as they are diverging from what should be the normal. They are diverging, and therefore they are weird, or in many cases historically, they are uncivilized or they are irrational. I want to make a distinction based on the inflow side's wording, because it says fully interpret, which means that it is not our burden to defend interactions with an equivalent amount of obscurity, as if like humans made first contact with extraterrestrials, in which there is zero comprehension whatsoever. There is some level of relation, and I think there's some level of foundational relation. I can understand that someone in Russia views like light blue and dark blue as two completely different colors that might have two different meanings without understanding their entire worldview and their entire history. The first thing I also want to add in terms of giving greater specificity as to how communication breakdown occurs in opposition world, with greater specificity than our opening, is because you mismatch whether cultures are high context or low context communication bases. If you are a high context culture, you are heavily reliant on implicit meanings, body language, and other things like tone and style, etc. Whereas in low context cultures, for example, in Australia and the United States, you are very reliant on explicit verbalization, which means that a lot of the harm comes from you
extrapolating the wrong meaning because you look at the wrong messaging in terms of how people go about verbalizing or communicating the things that they want to get across to other people. I think this is greater and more tangible than our opening because they say you offend and disrespect people, but they do not actually analyze ontologically why that actually occurs in the first place. But I think the reason why people are generally quite ethnocentric in the opposition world when you have this norm is because, yes, I think it is poignant for Yannicka to point out that there are dominant cultures, and those dominant cultures are usually the ones making encroachments to initiate this interpretation or interaction in the first place. Historically, they were colonialists who arrived on land unwelcomed. So, like, secondly, as they say, they have more capital to do more tourism, to go and initiate those interactions. But thirdly, they have the first mover advantage when it came to digitalization of social media, and therefore, like, American cultural zeitgeist is the dominant thing on social media for a lot of people. Therefore, when the culture shifts from your cultural zeitgeist, it shakes your worldview. It feels weird. It feels uncomfortable, which warrants a bunch of harms that I'm going to go through. Because in opposition world, you try to box that culture into your conception of the world. Whereas in the government side, you investigate and seek out, even if you can't know that culture entirely. The harm in the opposition has to cop, particularly when it comes to interpretations of minority cultures, is that indigenous ontologies are viewed as divergence from the norm, which warrants correction. When the British arrived in Australia, they approached the Aboriginal and Indigenous people as if they would have the same reasoning about the actions that they took or how they justified doing certain things in their daily routine. And despite the fact that a lot of their ontologies were based on things like spirituality and storytelling and time not necessarily being linear, I think that as a result, a lot of justifications in spirituality, which are prevalent in millions of in hundreds of indigenous cultures around the world, are often boxed out by the dominant cultures who make those encroachments. I want to now talk about international aid and how this flows into here, because I have a very poignant example. When the World Health Organization employed an aid program in Ghana in an attempt to fight the Ebola epidemic, they assumed that people in Ghana viewed medical decision making in the exact same way. In Ghana, people often viewed medical decision making as something spiritual, as something communitarian, in which you have to consult other people before you make individual choices. Whereas the World Health Organization assumed that everyone just intrinsically valued self-autonomy and the individual having the only say about their health, which meant that the aid program fell apart because when they tried to impose medical dichotomies and medical decisions on individuals in Ghana, they ran away from the medical facilities in fear, terrified that they are being imposed, that these foreign people were imposing things on them that were simply that they simply did not understand. I think that particularly in a time when you have increasing armed conflict globally, more refugees exist in the world now than there were 30 years ago, and the increasing amount from climate change as well, it is massively important that aid agencies do not immediately approach a program or an operation with the assumption that people interpret the world in the same way, because that's when those programs scare people. It is when those programs fall apart and the individual aid workers butcher the interactions. And you should weigh that very highly, given those aid programs save thousands of lives and they need to be bought into by the individuals who want the aid before they can succeed. But before I continue, just opening have a POI.
Yeah, only at a time when we believe that we can comprehend the culture, we have an incentive to teach, for example, indigenous culture in the textbook, which is the prerequisite for you to reduce discrimination in the society and access any benefit you want to talk about.
But it manifests in an imposition in your world. Indigenous people did not want the British coming in and saying, here is the Bible, you need to understand it because you are in the wrong and you are weird. They wanted respect for their own culture, which is what you do not get in your world based on all of the things I've already said. But talking about history and epistemology, you have an incentive to study things where you do not assume you have an innate understanding. That is to say that when you study things, you acknowledge that although there is an inability to fully interpret, there is not a complete block to everything. You can understand things at some degree because people get a satisfaction from broadening their horizons. People gain a satisfaction from gaining a little bit of an understanding. If I get to know someone for days of my own culture, that feels less satisfying than getting to know a couple small things about a completely different culture that's a completely different history to me, because it feels like a greater challenge for me as an individual and me in terms of social interactions, which means I think you will better relationships between people with cultures because they view small interactions and small gains in understanding as more intrinsically valuable and value them and treasure them and pursue them more into the future. Never been prouder to govern.
Thank you for that great speech. Now calling on member of opposition.
I just want to check if I'm audible and clear.
Audible, visible, yes.
All right, give me a few seconds and I'll get started. Opening opposition is a bit confusing in this debate because they argue that empathy creates integration. But insofar as they don't illustrate what that integration looks like, we don't think they particularly have an outcome here. At best, empathy is able to create some level of tolerance under the side of opening opposition. It's unclear as to why empathy becomes the tipping point to integration or to people understanding each other as a whole. The way closing opposition will enter this debate is to explain why cultural preservation is best done only through these forms of integration and understanding as a whole, because it creates a culture that's more dynamic and more adept and more sustainable, which stands for what culture is inherently about, which is preserving communities and giving individuals an avenue to practice what they believe is most core to their identity. First question then, as to what are the circumstances that the average individual faces when dealing with their culture amidst the globalization and the changing of the world that's occurring out there. It's important to note that the world is globalizing and changing all the time. Look at the fact that multiple countries or multiple forms of immigrations are happening all the time because of just how accessible things like accessing different living spaces have become. This means that oftentimes in countries like the USA, countries like Malaysia, you have so many mixes of many different cultures, many different beliefs, and many different communities fundamentally who are oftentimes interacting and engaging with one another across A, trying to assimilate into society as a whole to create a cohesive society that they're able to integrate in and live good lives in, but B, also inherently feel a value towards their culture as a whole. Second part of this, people also do value culture, we agree, but the problem here is that the biggest issue that the average individual face is this dissonancing issue between A, being able to practice your culture fully to the degrees that culture concurrently demands of you, but two, the ability to integrate and adapt into the different myriad of cultures that exist around you, which oftentimes means that this is a big dissonanting factor where individuals most of the time feel like they're unable to fulfill one without the compromise of the other, which means this leads to the second question very clearly, which is why are the barriers that exist to cultural development and change something that is significantly harder in a world where you're culturally incomprehensive, like the world of GovBench? First thing, the importance of culture is to be dynamic, flexible, and adaptable fundamentally to secure sustainability, to build communities for people to fall back around, to feel like there's a core identity that they can relate to. The problem here is that the reason this doesn't happen is because oftentimes cultures under their model are ones that have a level of internal rigidity within them in and of itself, because the idea of shifting, the idea of integration, or the idea of any subtle change to adapt to the changes that are concurrently occurring in the world is a fear of loss of their culture. The reason for this, the reason behind this is because of the principle or the perception of incomprehensibility that exists, because you perceive other cultures as fundamentally different. The very fact that even the slightest change or the forms of changes and adaptations that you want to make are oftentimes internally perceived as a big degradation or a big loss of your culture fundamentally because of the distinction and the emphasis of differences that exist between these cultures as a whole. Thirdly, this means feeling like integrating or making adaptable cultures is something that's oftentimes perceived as losing out to other cultures, or the very minute forms of differentiation are emphasized as losses, the point in which you view this as any form of change as a whole. Fourth, the problem here is that we explain to you as to how under a world where the incomprehensible perception of cultures is one that is viewed as fundamentally different, you oftentimes create more stagnancy in cultures, because firstly, cultures refuse to adopt changes because they feel as if it's a bleeding away of their culture or a grasping change as a whole. But the problem here is that the biggest victims of these cultures are the very people who are within these cultures as a whole. What does this mean then? Look at Indian communities where you have parents and children who oftentimes feel a disconnect, because the reality is the world of globalization forces you or pressures you to some degree to make some level of adaptations, which firstly already on the first level harms the abilities for people to feel like they're able to practice their culture meaningfully or engage with it in a proper manner. Secondly, it harms the ability for communities to come together as a whole, because this is something that becomes significantly more difficult. The simple impact here is to suggest that cultures oftentimes lose that ability to be flexible and dynamic and sustainable, and the ability to self-preserve because of the fact that this rigidity is oftentimes perceived in antagonization to the differentiation that you view. Harm here is simple. People usually tend to opt out or isolate away from these cultures, or B, people suffer to integrate within their society, which imposes direct practical harms on them. The dissonance that you face as an individual is something that's very difficult, especially if you're someone who wants to practice your culture and who want to somewhat integrate into your society and fit in. Why then does cultural comprehensibility shift that narrative specifically? Because one, it's important to note that culture isn't dependent on the preservation of everything exactly. It's about the preservation of core values that bring communities together and make people feel a pride in those values and the fact that they represent that culture as a whole. Incomprehensibility there on GAF fundamentally believes in differences of changes are being a form of erosion as a whole. But it's simple here on our side. It is the acknowledgement of fundamental principle similarities through comprehensibility that oftentimes shift the narrative in the way cultures perceive change and perceive other cultures as a whole. Which means one, you don't feel like making a change or adaptation is a form of erasure because it's a core tenet of multiple other cultures that come together. Like core principles like family, core principles like perhaps your own traditional clothing are not things that you particularly feel are antagonizing to make changes to, antagonizing to make shifts to as a whole. The simple thing that we want to explain here is that under our side, the changes that you make or the simple adaptations to make culture more accessible for your own communities are not perceived as changing the way of your culture, but it is perceived as a different way of expressing your culture, as an evolution of your culture to cater to the needs of your community, for people to opt in and to be able to practice it more meaningfully. This means that under our side, we can have different practices or changes within these cultures, but the fundamental roots or principles of what these cultures stand for are things that we don't necessarily have to erase. We're shifting the way individuals practice cultures. If you look historically, it is only through this mechanism that cultures have been able to sustain themselves. Historically, a lot of cultures that have died out or are no longer practiced were because of the fact that they, in antagonization, had to opt into more conservative mechanisms, like subjecting them away from liberalizing outcomes or making changes that make them more adaptable as a whole. This impact here is proving to you as to firstly, why we are the side that's able exclusively through this model of finding relatability in other cultures, able to create that desensitization effect that encourages the dynamic evolution of cultures. Fourth question in this speech, why is this extremely valuable for an individual's ability to practice their culture? First, culture is less afraid to evolve because common principles of understanding make you feel like you aren't losing out, which means you're able to make shifts in changes. You're able to make changes in the way you practice your culture. But this doesn't necessarily have to come at the biggest expense of the core principles of culture. It can be the manifestations of evolution. We make this more palatable. Secondly, relevancy and applicability of these cultures to the people that matter most, which are the people that were part of these cultures. More people are likely to subscribe to this. More people are likely to find ways to practice it in their own meaningful ways. And this inherently already preserves this culture because it allows for the creation of communities. It allows for individuals to bond across these cultures in a more palatable way without suffering the impacts of feeling like they lose out on integration. Fourthly, we break the dissonance that people feel because we allow for the flexibility for individuals to practice this culture in the way that they find meaningful within their current circumstances, which makes it inherently more valuable to people as a whole. This looks like maybe celebrating Christmas, but also celebrating Deepavali as a Hindu, because these are things that are predicated on the same principles. You're best able to practice your culture, best able to integrate into your society. What aside that gives you the exclusive mechanism here that's beating our opening because it isn't contingent on tolerance specifically.
Thank you for that great speech. Now calling on Government Web.
Wait, can I be heard clearly?
Audible, visible.
Awesome, thank you. As cringe as it is to put personal anecdotes into speeches, I am someone who is half from different cultures. I'm half Chinese, I'm half New Zealander, which means that when at first, I did have the inclination to distance myself from the culture that was different, the culture that did not align with the New Zealand culture that I had been brought up with. But as I got older, I recognized that these cultural differences were very valuable. They helped me see the world in a different way. They were not knowable to me at first, but as I investigated, and even though I may never never fully understand the intricacies of Chinese culture, because it's a culture I did not grow up in, the more I investigate it, the more I try to understand it, I recognize how valuable it is to have cultural differences and uniquenesses. I recognize how different it is to make sure that culture is distinct and understandable. So when the CO team comes up and tells you that the answer, the best path forward is to completely assimilate, and the only way to culturally survive is to assimilate, I tell you that far more cultures have died out because they were forced to assimilate than ones that have survived. If all cultures, when the British came and tried to dominate, decided to just go with the British rule and assimilate as much as possible, everyone would be speaking English, no one would have different worldviews, no one would have different perspectives. You wouldn't have different cultural practices, because eventually the inclination is to just continually assimilate. If you live in a worldview where you understand that you assume that all cultures are fundamentally the same, and that the inclination should just be to conform and assimilate as much as possible, you end up in a world where there's no cultural differences, there's no cultural distinction, there's no value, because people aren't able to practice their unique historical cultures that date back for millennia. You have a complete loss of cultural values. I think the world that CO is projecting is extremely harmful. I think they should lose this debate. Then onto, I think it's really important to be very clear about what we bring to the table as CG. First off, the first contribution that we give you is we give you a very clear distinction of what the two sides of this debate look like in a way that isn't really brought up by the other teams. I think it's a very important distinction that when you see on the info slide, the definition of incomprehensibility is that understanding that you have an inability to fully interpret different cultures. That is not complete unknowability. There will always be similarities between you and other cultures, but a cultural incomprehensibility comes with the understanding, the underlying assumption that you will never be able to fully understand or fully interpret a different culture. You still have similar things, you still have families, you still have language, you still have cultural practices. There are always similarities that you can figure out, but also in the same way that Owen told you, you can learn about different cultures. You can learn that Russians see the color blue and dark blue completely differently, but you can understand that you will never have the same worldview. You will never be able to see the world in the same way that someone who grew up speaking Russian is able to, which means that you are able to fuel this kind of curiosity and inquisitivity, which directly responds to a lot of the material that OO brings you about the incentive to learn about other cultures. We tell you that even though the human race knows that we will never be able to understand the depths of space because it is too broad and too vast for any human to fully understand within their lifetimes, this is an incentive for us to try. If we understand that we can never fully know something, that there are depths of knowledge that we will never understand about a certain subject matter, it fuels our human curiosity to try and learn as much as possible as we can about it. Even though we understand that we'll never be able to fully interpret the depths of space or the knowledge of the universe, we still try in the same way that we are still going to try, or there is a greater incentive for human beings to try and understand and learn about different cultures when we recognize that we're never going to be able to fully interpret these cultures. The comparative is you assume that all human cultures are fundamentally the same. This means that there is no incentive on your behalf to go out and try and learn more about different cultural practices, different ways of thinking, because you assume they are all the same. This is the underlying assumption that the colonists had when they landed on the beaches of Australia. They assumed that the indigenous people had the same moral frameworks, the same fundamental understanding, and the same fundamental values as they did. So when they did things that did not seem in line with the Western colonial worldview, they assumed that they were backwater, they assumed that they were outdated, they assumed that they were crazy and acting within malice and needed to be corrected. When you have an assumption that you don't fully understand another human culture, you are more likely to try and learn about it than just prescribe your own ideals and your own assumptions about how people should act onto other beings. I think this is a very important distinction that we clear up in this debate in a way no other team does. I'll take that POI from OO.
Yeah, obviously UK government has incentive to do assimilation and colonization for seizing power, for getting more resources. So only in our side there's more reparation to indigenous people when their history get reported in mainstream media.
Okay, so I think when you have assimilation, if you the way that not incomprehensibility looks is you defer to Indigenous points of view, or you recognize that Indigenous communities have a fundamentally different worldview to you, which is more important in terms of reparations because it means that you defer to Indigenous communities on how they best think reparations should be carried out, instead of just having a colonialist worldview of being like, okay, I'm just going to pay you a lump sum of cash in order to like achieve these reparations you want so badly. Instead, you have consultation with Indigenous stakeholders and they tell you that I don't care about money, I want my land back, I want to be able to cultivate Indigenous ways of life in the same ways that my ancestors did. So you actually listen to them and you are able to achieve these reparations in a much more constructive way than you would when you just assume that you're fundamentally the same, you still fundamentally have the same moral framework and the same values. We also give you unique additions and impacts and how this impacts things like foreign aid. It means you can actually get help and healthcare to like countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have different moral frameworks about how they receive healthcare. It means you actually are able to help these people. And finally, this large impact in terms of epistemology, we tell you that when you have a better understanding or you strive for a better understanding of the lived experiences of other cultures, you broaden your worldview. This is so important to scientific research. We can never fully understand paleontology and different ways of life if we are unwilling to recognize that different cultures have different moral frameworks, different worldviews that we will never fully understand, but we can still strive to understand. Thank you.
Thank you for that great speech. Now calling on opposition whip.
I'm assuming you can see me and hear me.
Yes to both.
Cool. Start in a couple of seconds. The strongest thing that this bench has is the idea that we simply just shouldn't try to integrate, and we should allow cultures to exist as they are, as long as we can tolerate each other. This is problematic on a couple of levels. First, the ability to practice aspects of your culture is contingent on the political allowance to make sure that you can do it and to allow you to do so. This is contingent on society as a whole being able to accept you in the first place and doesn't view your own practices as backwards and contradictory. They need to allow you to wear a hijab to the workplace. They need to agree to shut down the streets so that you can have your parades and your processions, which means that you need the complete acceptance of society as a whole in order for your rights and privileges to be protected. Second, difference in cultures creates in-group, out-group dynamics. So this is finally going to affect you in the workplace. It's going to affect your children in school, your ability to make friends, your ability to make connections. This is all going to have a consequence on your ability to maximize agency and live a better life. Third, you're now most susceptible to political economic interests that tell people to oppose you and shut down your culture instead. So every time you end up in a situation where it's a zero sum of prioritizing your culture and your values over that of a different one, all you do is understand what they are, but you can disagree still fundamentally with what they stand for, and you're always going to prioritize your own culture over theirs because you have no shared points of commonality. You have no reason to justify why they should be allowed to worship their pagan gods or why they should be allowed to cover their women up, even if for the sake of protection or whatever it is, and you're always going to justify it in favor of your own tradition, of your own culture. I want you to observe here that integration just does not mean that you're going to give up on core aspects of your identity, like your religion, the language that you speak, and the shared values that you might have with your diaspora or whatever. It just means that you are more willing to accept whatever the majority culture is. You are more willing to evolve your own culture and integrate it seamlessly with the cultures that exist outside there as well. This isn't a brand new thing. This is what your culture has been doing for 500 years. You can be Asian, you can be New Zealander. The culture that you practice now, that you value so much, has not been the same culture that your people practiced 500 years ago. Praveen explicitly explained to you that people don't want to integrate fully right now because of the fear, and this is exactly what the GovVip feeds into, the fear that integration means that you must give up completely on aspects of your culture and you must give up completely on the core values and identities that you hold on to right now. This is what drives them to become more conservative. This is what makes them double down and become more strict in their own practices. They force their children to practice on this. They give up on the leisures in life because they believe that they need to live a more pure life. They need to live the way their ancestors lived. This is how you justify the most oppressive parts of their culture making comebacks and gaining popularity among among these people and communities as well, because they believe that they need to hold on to it. If not, white culture is going to come and override us and completely wipe us off the face of the earth. You do all of this for the sake of protecting your old culture and not let yourself become like washed or whatever. This is what creates conflict between generations. This is how people end up just not practicing their culture out of spite. Under our counterfactual, we allow people to integrate better, because integrating now isn't seen as giving up on your culture. Integrating is seen as holding on to the shared values and communal ties that you have, but evolving the way that you practice it. It means that you're still able to have the same values because you have the values and other people have the values as well. We are just practicing them differently. So maybe you don't celebrate Deepavali as often as you do, but it still means that you can practice the same things in your celebration of Christmas. Maybe you are a lot more liberal with your children and you don't like forbid them from having sexual relations when they are teenagers, for instance, but you're still premised on the value of allowing them to grow and learn responsibility, which is manifest in different ways, but are still contingent and premised on the same thing. The weighing here is that this happens both ways. So minorities can integrate better with the majority and don't go through all the harms that we listed out to you earlier, but the majority is also now more willing to accept minority cultures and are less likely to demonize them as well. So you can still practice important parts of your culture, be it language or whatever, that truly are like identity markers that are important to you, while giving up on other things that may be less important or may be difficult for you to practice in status quo anyway because of just like you're a small minority, migrant or whatever. The next question I want to answer here is on which side do people treat each other better? The OG claim here is that there are some aspects of culture that are fundamentally impossible to relate to. CO builds off of all of this. So breaking down this point means CO is not much of an extension, which like check your notes. I don't think a lot of these things add up very logically anyway. Gut check, they cannot name you a single instance in which you absolutely cannot relate to the culture or like a practice of a different tradition. That is not contingent on you having limited information of the other culture. That is not contingent on an overwhelming political and economic incentive for you to want to impose something on the culture or that culture wanting to impose something back on you as well. This simply cannot be the context of the debate because we live in a very, very globalized world. We all have similar access to technology. We all have similar levels of like civilization, and our conceptions of morality and politeness are all quite similar as well. PM themselves frame this. So if you're going to buy CGKs, you need to observe this as a knife. But what if what they really do is so foreign? You think that this is fine because now you have a certain point in which you can fundamentally, morally disagree with them and not choose to engage with their culture. So if the culture supports genital mutilation, repressing the rights of women, and you just disagree with this, like fine, you can disagree with it completely as well. The final claim that they have in this regard is that you would perceive them as being weird if you're unable to understand them. But if the thing is so foreign and unidentifiable to you, you will also perceive them as being weird, which means the ways that you treat them are likely to be just as oppressive, just as harmful. I'll take opening.
The reason it is unjustified for women covering up hair, as you say, because this is a normative moral assertion I can only make if I consider that culture to be applicable to my morality and worldview. This is your world.
Don't make the normative assumption. Try to find the shared values as to why they choose to cover up and try to accept them for what that is. Like, don't impose morality on people. That's pretty bad, guys. Let's be charitable and engage on the medium ground of there are differences in the ways that parents raise children, for instance, or differences in sexual freedom awarded towards teenagers. The way that you find shared values is simply by looking at the principles that you have and the different practices and how they manifest on either side of the house. So one side expects children to leave the house once they turn 18, another side expects them to stay with the family and cater towards the family. Both sides can acknowledge that this is based on the value of teaching your children responsibility. So this is how you're able to find a shared point of commonality, and you can agree this is an important thing, even if you disagree in the ways that you're able to manifest it. They impact all of this on improving understanding between people. The first claim is that you should latch on to other characteristics. This is symmetrical. If someone is respectable and polite, we can learn to appreciate them and respect them for the same reason. Second, they claim you need to be able to empathize with each other without appropriating and misrepresenting. This is contradictory to their claim on information, the ability to process something that's completely foreign to you, because if you don't understand it, you are going to like misrepresent it and appropriate it the same way as well. OO's response to this is we need empathy. Empathy simply isn't enough because empathy does not mean you're going to give up on your own privileges, on your own protections in order to be able to cater towards other people. What OO proves at best is that you can be tolerant of each other. It is exclusively through the mechanism that Praveen gives to you as to how integration can happen both ways in a more seamless way while still preserving aspects of your culture that you can be weighed to be the most important is the biggest impact in this round and is the only line of argumentation that unlocks the claim of people being able to treat each other better, because now you're no longer fundamentally opposed to each other in terms of what you stand for from your traditional point of view or what you stand for as an individual. CO.
Thank you for that great speech. That ends the